Today, Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity tells us how to share your faith.
The message is how to share your faith with skeptics.
He begins with a story about he, as this teen, was told his brother was almost an atheist. He was doubting his faith. So he spent a week preparing for what turned into an awkward conversation to try to save him. My words, not his. He says what resulted could be used to train believers on how not to share their faith. So here he is, to tell his audience what he did wrong then and how to do better. Think he really will? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. Cameron Bertuzzi's opening ends with this slide, exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief. So let's see if Cameron has an intellectual side for us, shall we?
I was like, this is going to be easy. I'll just go talk to him. So I called him up. I was like, hey, look, let's talk. So we get to his house, and it was about a week later after I called him. And during that week, I just researched everything that I could find. I looked up debates, I looked up evidence and arguments for the existence of God. And so I had about a week to prepare, and I got to his house, and so just setting the scene, he opens the door, and there's immediately an elephant in the room.
Here is the first issue for Cameron. He was unprepared for the conversation. The week he spent preparing was in vain, as he prepared the wrong material. This is a common mistake made by both believers and unbelievers, assuming you know what the other is thinking, or that you know the other's position. I have believers think that I'm joking when I ask very basic questions about their beliefs. I'm not. People have all kinds of beliefs. When someone tells me that they are a Christian, that tells me very little. They might be Catholic, Baptist, Presbyterian, Jehovah's Witness, Mormon. Some Universalists call themselves Christian. Even with a denomination, people's beliefs still differ. Some believe in eternal security, inerrancy, literalism, and so on. I had believers tell me that God is in control of everything, or that God only intervenes when he deems it necessary. So any conversation about one's beliefs has to begin with establishing what those beliefs are. If you don't start there, your talking points aren't likely to hit where the other person is. Will Cameron conclude this?
And there were basically three things. First, it wasn't about love. That night, I went over there and I wanted to win an argument. I wasn't over there to love on my brother. I wanted to win an argument. Second, I didn't really care about truth. It wasn't about truth for me. I wanted to go over there and I wanted to defend what I grew up believing. And then third, it wasn't about knowledge. I didn't actually care about knowledge about Christianity. I cared about appearing as if I had knowledge.
I'm not sure at this point if he has concluded that. Maybe this will be part of one of those 3 points. I can't tell yet.
But what I'm convinced of is that if you master these 3 areas, then you can have a conversation with anybody, including skeptics.
One thing that Cameron didn't learn is how not to be condescending. Skeptics are people, just like believers. The way he says this implies that having a conversation with a skeptic is more difficult. Maybe I'm reading too much in, but I also see an implication that skeptics are unreasonable, which is sometimes the case, but believers can be unreasonable too. Again, we are all people, and as people, we have some commonalities. What I find really problematic with this statement is how it acts to poison the well for future conversations with skeptics. It leaves his audience feeling that a conversation with a skeptic is a more difficult conversation than, say, a conversation with a believer who has beliefs that are different from theirs. It isn't. How easy or difficult it is to make your point or express your opinion is no different no matter who your listener is. If you have fewer points of commonality, it will likely take longer to reach a point where you both get what the other is saying. But that can be just as true when talking to another believer as it is when talking to a skeptic, particularly when that other believer is as steadfast in what they believe as you are. I feel like Cameron has really learned very little about conversations at this point, as he demonstrates that with this statement. He seems to be approaching a conversation with the goal of winning, of scoring points, of showing his interlocutor why he is right and they are wrong. And I will confess that I make this error as well. But if you're going to give a presentation on how to have a good conversation,
I would rather have a good conversation.
this isn't a good place to start from. You need to start from a position where you are both on level ground. You both have a point of view to express, and you each should want to listen to and understand the other's position. Instead, Cameron, like many believers I have encountered, want to claim the high ground.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
I'm right. Let me show you where you are wrong. This won't get you a conversation. This gets you talking down to a person that you consider to have an inferior viewpoint. And while both should begin being convinced of their viewpoint, that doesn't mean that they need to be smug about it. One can be confident in one's knowledge without being condescending, which means listening to the other with an open mind. Many believers don't or won't do this because they are afraid of being convinced that they are wrong. At least it was for me. Maybe I'm guilty of projecting here. And ultimately, I was right. Once someone came along with a good reason to change my beliefs, I did. What I find amusing about this is all the people that quote Romans 1:20 to me, claiming that deep down I know that God is real, when in fact the opposite is closer to the truth. As a believer, deep down I always suspected that it might not be real. I'm sure that some believer will latch on to that statement and say, "Aha! You were never a real believer. You only thought God was real, but you were never sure." But if this is what it takes to be a real believer, to be absolutely sure and never have any doubt, has there ever been a real believer? There were most definitely times, years even, when I had no doubts. And apologists will tell you that they all have times of doubt. If this is in fact the test of a real believer, I'm not sure that even Jesus could pass the test.
So let's look at the first one, which is loving people. And again, that night I wasn't there to love on my brother. I was not. I was there to win an argument. I didn't really care what he had to say. I wasn't trying to listen to him. And I couldn't see the value in his journey of truth-seeking. And I think that's actually the journey that he was on. He was on a journey to find the truth. But I couldn't see the value in the courage that it took for him to actually embark on something like that.
Cameron makes a very good point here. This is where we all need to be in a conversation. Maybe not loving each other, that's a bit much for a conversation with a stranger or acquaintance, but valuing the other's journey. Note to believers, when you start a conversation with, "I want to share this in love," and you don't even know the person, it's not the draw you think it is. It's off-putting. Even if that is what you are thinking, maybe keep your expressions of love to yourself, at least until we get to know each other a little better. Summarizing a bit, Cameron puts up this slide, which does have some general direction. If you are arrogant or rude or insisting on your own way, you are not having a good conversation. I'm now wondering if the reason Cameron said this about love is just so he could use this verse. Most believers I have encountered genuinely feel that it is an act of love, or at least of concern, to share their faith. I get that, as they think that we unbelievers are destined to hell. But believers need to understand that when we skeptics discuss our beliefs, we share the same concern. We are concerned that believers are throwing away their time, energy, and resources in the only life that they have, chasing an illusion. Worse yet, they are so convinced that the illusion is real that they are willing to change their lifestyle to satisfy the desires of this non-entity. And of course, the worst part of all is they feel that we, unbelievers, need to live our lives as if we believe the same way they do. Maybe Cameron and friends would do well to realize that we too are sharing the truth in love, or at least concern for your best interests, just as you think that you are doing.
None of this is like remotely close to what happened that night with my brother. I was impatient, I was short, I was loud, I didn't try to understand his views. I didn't try to understand how or why he actually got to any of his views. I was waiting for my own opportunity to talk.
This is some good self-reflection on Cameron's part. He recognizes where he went wrong in the discussion and wants to do better. We could ask nothing more for all of us.
But love, it requires you to listen. You've actually got to listen to what the other person is saying, not just the type of listening where you're like waiting for your chance to speak, but the actual type of love where you're genuinely interested in what the other person is saying.
Except for the love part, I completely agree. Well, his conversation was with his brother, so there should be an element of love there. With a stranger or an acquaintance, that's just weird. But even with a stranger, we all need to truly listen to each other. Fear of not being heard drives so much of the political divide in this country.
That night, again, it wasn't about loving truth in my conversation with my brother. It was about defending what I grew up believing. And at the time, I would have said that I wanted him to believe what's true, but really I wanted him to believe what I believed.
This is a very candid admission. It's not unique to Cameron. Most believers, not just Christians, but anyone who has a belief that is near and dear to them, it need not even be a religious belief, will feel this way. We want other people, and particularly people close to us, to be like us, to believe the same things that we do. The question is truth important, or is just having the same belief important? If it doesn't matter to you whether or not it's true, you just want to believe it, so you do, okay. But is there really any reason for you to share such a belief? If it isn't true, it really doesn't matter.
Truth is that which corresponds to reality. And this is called, there's a technical term for it, really fancy technical term, called the correspondence theory of truth. Brett, you can write that down if you want. The correspondence theory of truth. Now, some people are truth relativists. Have any of you guys heard that term, truth relativism? Like, you've probably heard it put this way: I have my truth, you have your truth, everyone has their own truth. Ta-da.
Does anyone actually say this? I'm not sure.
So there's actually something really wrong with this, and that is that it's self-defeating. So is it absolutely true that truth is relative? That's a question you can ask someone who espouses this view. Is it absolutely true that truth is relative? If it's absolutely true, then absolute truth exists, and so truth relativism is false.
Cameron, by this reasoning, wants you to accept that if there is a single absolute, then all truth is absolute. He doesn't say it, but it's implied. If he dismisses all relativistic thinking because a single absolute could exist, does he then dismiss all absolutes if a single exception exists to what he considers to be an absolute? Is it not possible that some things are absolute and some things are not? Personally, I don't think there are any absolutes, even the proposition that there are no absolutes. If you're asking if there are no absolutes, including that one, then there must be an absolute. Yes, it's the exception to the rule that there are no exceptions, which then proves the rule. And if you think I'm being inconsistent here, I might be. This is a gray area where I just don't know enough to be sure. But what I can be sure of is that if a single absolute does exist, that doesn't prove anything else is absolute. I think Cameron tried to apply the argument against there being no absolutes in the wrong scenario. It doesn't fit here. You're supposed to make this argument with someone who says there are no absolutes, except I don't think anyone actually says that, so he tries to make it fit here. Oh well, he tried.
Now, most people these days won't say that truth is actually relative. I think that they'll want to admit that some things are absolutely true. Like if you're in a conversation with a skeptic, they might say evolution is absolutely true. Like that's a non-negotiable thing.
I don't think Cameron really gets the skeptic view of evolution. It is true, but it is definitely not an absolute. We make new discoveries all the time and tweak our understanding of evolution. The entire study was revised at the discovery of genetics as we found the mechanism that makes it work. There could still be another area of science that we have yet to discover that could again shift our understanding of evolution. So it isn't an absolute. It isn't non-negotiable. What is non-negotiable is believing that all the evolution that we see around us can be dismissed as false. Saying that nothing can evolve is non-negotiable. Even the most conservative of believers that actually read anything on the subject, that is, will agree that species do change. They do adapt. They do pass down genes that make them more prone to survival. They just won't admit that that is evolution.
These days, I don't really think you're going to get to interact with a whole lot of people that are going to be truth relativists. But the point is that truth truth is that which corresponds to reality, and truth is not relative, it's objective.
Did you catch the pivot here? I'll play it again. He began the discussion by comparing relative truth with absolute truth.
Now, most people these days won't say that truth is actually relative. I think that they'll want to admit that some things are absolutely true.
But he concludes that therefore truth is objective.
Truth is that which corresponds to reality, and truth is not relative, it's objective.
Objective and absolute are not the same. Believers commonly use these terms interchangeably, as Cameron has done here. Cameron is right that truth is objective. It is based on what is observable, because that is what objective means, at least in the sense he is using it here. But absolute does not mean observable. Absolute is not the same as objective. So his showing that truth is based on what we observe, it is objective, does nothing to support his claim that truth can be absolute. Absolute is defined as universally valid, since he's using it as a noun here and not as an adjective. That truth is observable does nothing to demonstrate that truth is universally valid. Yet for some reason, Cameron thinks that he just proved that.
All right, now let's move on to a distinction between what I believe.
And he moves on, as if he made his point, when he really didn't.
Between what I believe and what's true. There's a difference between what you believe and what's true.
True. Good point.
You're not right about everything. You got to just get used to this. You got some false beliefs, okay? What you believe is not necessarily what's true. And what happens in conversations with skeptics or anybody is if we're not careful, we're going to seek to defend what we believe instead of seeking the truth.
Fair point. If we were all seeking the truth instead of seeking to make a point or prove ourselves right, we would have better conversations. The problem is most people are more concerned about being perceived as right, even if they aren't. They want others to think that they are right, without first making sure that they really are right. That said, doing so is a difficult thing. No matter how much you learn about a particular thing, there is always something out there that you didn't see or consider. That thing might affirm your position, or disprove your position, or, more likely, show that your position needs to be modified a bit. Few people are completely right or completely wrong. Matt Powell might be one of those exceptions. You can't get much more wrong than Matt Powell.
Like they ask you a question you should know the answer to. It's very difficult to admit that I don't know. But get comfortable with it. Admitting you don't know can actually open someone up to hearing what you have to say. Because as you probably know, there is a Christian stereotype of Christians just are know-it-alls. They have to know everything. But if you admit in a conversation, I don't know, you know what? That's a really good point. I need to take that home. I'm going to take that home. I'm going to think about it, and I'll get back to you. And if you do that, you can really open them up to hearing what you have to say. There was about 20 different times during my conversation with my brother where I made up a response off the top of my head instead of just admitting, I don't know.
He's right. I've made that mistake myself and painted myself into a corner, and I've seen plenty of believers do it too. On the other hand, I see some people so afraid of being pinned to an indefensible position that they won't admit to very simple things. Like when I recently asked someone if their God was the omniscient creator. He tried to get God only creating some things and not others. That's fine. You can have whatever God you want, but if that's your God, then don't use the Bible to defend your position on that God, as that clearly isn't the God of the Bible.
This leads us to the third key, loving knowledge. In my conversation with my brother, I did not value knowledge. I did nothing but give half-baked answers to really tough questions for 3 hours.
This is another candid admission. I applaud Cameron for this level of introspection and willingness to admit that he was wrong. I hope he can carry this open-mindedness to ideas of others, in considering the possibility that his God claims might be unfounded.
Let's talk about how knowledge can actually help remove our insecurities. Knowledge can eliminate fear and insecurity. I remember when I was a teenager, I was asked to share my faith with unbelievers, and it was the most terrifying time of my life. And the reason for that, as I've reflected on it, is because I didn't really know the gospel. I didn't have knowledge of the gospel, and that was what was really driving all the fear and anxiety that I was experiencing about sharing the gospel.
I've heard a lot of people say this. I always found it odd, as I never felt this way. Maybe I was just too cocky, as I thought I had all the right answers.
And so a lack of knowledge can actually create fear. And not only can knowledge remove fear, it can also remove insecurities like anger. If you actually know what you believe and why you believe it, and you value knowledge, you're not going to have a whole lot of need to get defensive and angry at objections to your faith.
Very good point. I would add no need to project your fear and anger onto me and claim that I must be angry with your God. Next, Cameron has a clip of Dr. William Lane Craig.
One of the objections my brother raised early on when I spoke with him when he first converted or deconverted to atheism was about the problem of the unevangelized. What do we do with the man in Africa who's never heard the gospel? Isn't there something wrong with condemning this man to eternal conscious torment because he's never heard the gospel? What is your response to this?
Well, I would say he is not condemned because of his failure to hear and believe in the gospel. The Bible indicates that God will judge people on the basis of the light that they have. And so the people who have never heard the gospel of Christ won't be judged on that basis. That will be manifestly unfair. Rather, they will be judged on how they have responded to God's general revelation in nature and conscience, which is universally available at all times in history.
This sounds like Dr. Craig is advocating for a form of universalism. If a person doesn't hear about Jesus, but they love the God they did hear about, God will honor that and they are saved? If the person looks at the trees and knows instinctively that there is a God and honors that unknown God, are they saved? I don't think that this is what Dr. Craig means, but this is the theology that he has just expressed. Universalism for all who don't hear about Jesus.
So God is a loving God and a fair God who wants everyone to be saved and will judge people fairly on the basis of the light that they have. Now, having said that, I think that it is also possible that God has so providentially ordered the world that anyone who would believe in the gospel if he heard it is born at a time and place in history where he does hear it. And in that case, no one will be lost through historical or geographical accident. Anyone who wants or even would want to believe, if he heard the gospel, will have the opportunity to hear the gospel.
Let's think about that claim.
Why don't you ever just stop and think?
Well, stop and think, Bert?
Yes, stop and think!
If God, in making a person, knows from his omniscient knowledge that this person that he is making will accept Christ, So he puts this person in a position where they will hear the gospel. But if God is making a person he knows will be an atheist, it's okay to put them in a time or place where they will never hear the gospel. They don't need to hear the gospel because they're never going to accept it anyway. This raises some serious questions about God's character. Why is he making people he knows are destined for an eternity in hell? If he already knows the eternal destination of every person before he makes them, how can he then claim that that destination was in any way the responsibility of the person that he made? Also, how is eternal destiny not predetermined by God before he even made them? And if their eternal destiny was set before the person even existed, how can anyone by any stretch of the imagination call this a just God? He's an arbitrary God that makes a few people to be saved, but most people predestined to hell. To then claim that these people are judged for their own decisions, what decisions? Their options were predetermined by God before he even made them. What I find so frustrating is my inability to make this clear to a believer. Somehow they still claim that God gives this person a free will to make a decision that God knows and has foreseen that he will not make. But believers still claim that the person can make this decision, that he has the free agency to do so. However, this is to deny the omniscience of God, because if a person can make a decision other than one that God has foreseen, then God is no longer omniscient. If he can't, then he has no free will. Free will and an omniscient God are incompatible. They can't both exist simultaneously. If free will did in fact exist in Craig's theology, wouldn't it make more sense for God to do just the opposite of what Craig describes here? If you know that someone will follow Jesus, then they don't need to hear about Jesus. If you know that they won't, if in fact they have the free will to decide for themselves, wouldn't it make more sense to give them every opportunity to do so? Putting them in a position where they have no knowledge of this God that they are supposed to follow, then excusing yourself because you know they aren't going to follow, would be like a teacher refusing to give study materials to the lower level students because they're going to fail the test anyway. In what school system would anyone consider that to be a good teacher?
There are 3 ways to grow in knowledge, and I'm almost done. So first, study your Bible. And I don't mean reading your Bible. There's a difference between reading your Bible and studying your Bible.
Actually, studying the Bible is how many of us came to be atheists. The God claims of the Bible are incoherent.
To grow, you also need to study apologetics. That's number 2.
Not really. According to Braxton Hunter, even a woman could learn this.
And so I think they should do the same thing with apologetics. This may not be the thing that you get most excited about, and you husbands tell your wives about this. Maybe have them listen to this, because I think this is a battle cry for mothers. I believe they can learn these things.
My problem with apologetics is it's the same arguments over and over. The kalam, the teleological, the moral argument. We've been hearing the same thing for centuries. What's sad is that young believers hear this and think that they can convince skeptics because once they have the answer to the skeptics' questions, they will be convincing. The problem is we have heard these. Often we know them better than the believers do, and they aren't convincing. If they were, we wouldn't be skeptics, which to me should give you pause to consider the truth of the claims of your beliefs. If your beliefs are true, and a God is concerned about you having this knowledge, shouldn't God just reveal what people need to know so that they can all see that this is true? The excuse of the believer as to why God doesn't do this, is that God wants people to have faith, which makes no sense. If humans are supposed to choose God, how can they if they don't have enough information to make such a choice? What reasonable person, let alone a God, would ask you to make life and death decisions based on so little information that it is a decision of faith? This is not a good God. It is not a particularly intelligent God either.
The term apologetics comes from the root word apologia, which means to give a defense, like in a court case. And Christians have been giving rational defenses of Christianity and rational arguments for thousands of years.
If the point is that these arguments are old, shouldn't that be a clue that they don't work? As a believer, I was told that no one was ever argued into the kingdom. One needs to appeal to emotion or to personal experience, not to logic, to get someone to convert. Cameron is so convinced that his position is logical that if he has just the right argument, everyone will agree with him. If the argument hasn't worked for over 1,000 years, shouldn't that be a clue that the problem isn't with the person making the argument? It's that the argument itself is flawed.
Reason number 2, most skeptics are not actually ready to receive the gospel. They have too much emotional baggage. In other words, in Christian language, their hearts are hard. They're not ready. So set a modest goal for your conversations. Go in with the aim of placing a pebble in someone's shoe, and then let the Holy Spirit do the rest.
He's moved on to bonus tips, which is why the numbering system is different now. He says we won't get to the arguments because we have too much emotional baggage. This plays into the myth that most skeptics are so because they had a bad experience in a church. They were hurt by believers, so they don't want anything to do with believers. Sometimes this is the case, but not always. Just as the reasons why people believe are varied, the reasons why some people don't are also varied. He's actually broken his own first rule here. By assuming the skeptic has emotional baggage, he hasn't listened to the skeptic to find out why they don't believe. Worse is he assumes that belief is a natural state and unbelief is an unnatural state. The reason the skeptic doesn't believe is there is something wrong with the skeptic. The skeptic has emotional baggage or hasn't heard the arguments that he intends to make, as if hearing and understanding his position equates to believing it. He doesn't seem to get that under the best of circumstances, with all of the information you have, and having had no issues with other believers, many of us are still skeptics.
Bonus tip number 2, don't always have to go on the offense. In my conversation with my brother, he was making a lot of claims about Christianity himself, and he even at one point suggested that Jesus may not have existed. And my response to that was to go on the offense. Like I wanted to give arguments for Jesus existing in history, but instead what you can do is say, you know what, that's an interesting claim. What reason do you have to think that that's true? And when you do that, it can actually disarm somebody and put them on the offense. Now they've got to defend what they just claimed, and that can actually lead to them being open to being wrong.
Does this work for you, Cameron? If I ask you why you think that Jesus was resurrected, does that open you up to the idea that you might be wrong? No, it doesn't? I didn't think so. Now, Cameron is right. We all need to approach conversation with the idea that we might be wrong. But I question whether Cameron actually does that. I will agree that Cameron is willing to admit to errors that he has made in conversations. We've seen that here. He will admit that he doesn't know everything about his faith. It's why he relies on experts. But does he ever enter a conversation with the thought that he might be wrong about the truth of his beliefs? It's possible that he does, but I'm skeptical. He wants the believer here to shift the burden of proof to the skeptic by forcing the skeptic to make positive assertions, something that some skeptics are hesitant to do. I am not. I am quite willing to take on the burden of proof when I assert something. But when a skeptic says that they don't believe Jesus is who Cameron thinks he is, I don't think that that is an assertion. If the skeptic goes all the way to mythicism, then yes, it is. Braxton told us that that is a fringe group.
Well, you'll hear some people who are called mythicists today who believe that Jesus never existed. This is a fringe belief.
But if the skeptic goes there, then yes, they carry the burden of proof. But most skeptics say they don't believe the claims of the Bible about Jesus, which does not carry such a burden, as it makes no assertions. I think Cameron does his audience a disservice by implying that they can make this shift, when in fact it won't apply to most conversations.
So, but this first type of question, the what do you mean question, is sort of a fact-finding question. You want to know exactly what the claim is. And oddly enough, a simple question like, what do you mean, is sometimes enough to dissolve an objection. They might just be like, you know what? I don't know what I mean.
It works the other way around, too. The most common question that I ask believers is, why do you think that? The question doesn't presuppose any answer. It lets them go in any direction they like to defend their position. But Cameron is right. When I ask believers why they think, fill in the blank, the Bible is true, Jesus resurrected, the disciples died proclaiming Jesus to be God, whatever, often they have no answer. Cameron ends rather abruptly shortly after this, followed by a Q&A. All in all, Cameron is someone who I would gladly have a conversation with. However, there is one point that rather detracts from his claims. It's this, his merch, that proclaims that he is right and you are wrong if you don't agree, even before the conversation begins. A bit of advice, Cameron. If you expect your interlocutor to have an open mind in a conversation, it would be best to do the same. Maybe have the same expectations of yourself as you have of them. Oh well, at least he's trying. Live your life.
Now, most people these days won't say that truth is actually relative. I think that they'll want to admit that some things are absolutely true. Truth is that which corresponds to reality, and truth is not relative, it's objective.